Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome to another video. Now, I've got a bit of a topic to discuss. Recently, there's been some hints, theories, and all these other things that Evoker may be getting a third support-based spec. Now, there is some game stuff to back this up. There's been a lot of text that's been data mined that really does throw us towards this as a quite an obvious thing that's coming, um, almost to the fact that it's pretty much said in the game that evokers have these three specs. It has devastation, preservation, and a black dragonflight support S spec. And I wanted to talk about whether a support based spec would work in WoW and how we can look at other games to potentially make that decision. So I'm going to go back really far and go back to 2001, Dark Age of Camelot. It's a game that I remember as a kid playing, and used to have people that would have multiple accounts. They would have a second account that they had a friar, which they could go and do these long buffs, these like Mark of the Wild stamina-esque raid buffs. And they were specced into it. That was their sole job. You logged on, you got your buffs, you logged off, and that was it. You used to have minstrels that were almost required by raids to travel around the map. There was no fast travel, there was very few mounts. It was either an AFK system where you really slowly rode around the map or you ran. And minstrels were the fastest way to do that. They were so almost mandatory. You then had things like bards, which were kind of an off healer buff type class that were used heavily in fights and combat. But you saw that almost all of these supports were brought to every form of content. And one of those outweighed anything else in its position. You may not bring five bards, but you'll certainly bring one. You had to bring one. You look at then Final Fantasy, take another game that I've played a lot of, and you see certain classes and specs that bring attack power buffs or spell power buffs or boss debuffs, similar to how we have like the monk and demon hunter physical and magical debuff now in WoW. But it actually makes the group system and finding a group, especially at the higher end of Final Fantasy, quite difficult at times because, well, if you aren't the class they're looking for that specific buff or that specific debuff or whatever, then you're not the right fit for that group and you might not get invited because of your class. Now, this is something in WoW where they have had issues with this in the past and have managed to reduce it down to something where it's still something that is relevant, but it's not massive. It's not a major problem in WoW. So you look at things like Priest PI currently, it's an issue. It's something that it's just it's so nice to have. You bring them to the raids, you like them when they're in the group, but it's also actually not mandatory to bring them to your group. You bring them for other reasons, and the PI is a bonus. That's perfect. You've then got back to like if we talk about TBC days, we've just had TBC Classic, where you literally were bringing multiple shamans to swap them in and out of raid groups to bloodlust people. Um, I mean, even in Wrath Classic, which we've got currently, you have you bring a shaman to every raid for bloodlust. Like it's just not even a choice thing. In Kata, that kind of changes a little bit. You have multiple classes that can bring that in Mage as well, but it's still something where you have to have that one buff in your raid. Otherwise, you're going to have so many more issues. So it's still something that is relevant in WoW, although currently we have a system where most groups are decided, or the meta is certainly decided by the strongest classes, and that's fine. But bringing a support into WoW, and certainly something that is a sole support, right? So it may do damage, it may off heal, but we'll talk about that more in a minute. But its main job in a group is to either debuff enemies or buff allies or both. So buffing allies would require it to bring more buffs to damage and survivability than you would get by just bringing another DPS. If we look at a roughly even split of each DPS bringing 25% of the group's total damage, and then the tank and the healer bringing the last 25%, I know it's not quite that, but it's simple math, you need a support to cover that 25% or certainly have some very good reasons as to why not. Now, you look at things like, I'm obviously talking from a dungeon perspective, you look at High Mythic Plus. The thing that they struggle with in High Mythic Plus is very rarely healing or whatever. It's just, do you have enough damage to kill the mobs in time? They just have so much health, so much multiplier. Do you have enough damage to actually get that done in time? So they're not going to drop DPS ever for that scenario. They want more, if nothing else. In terms of debuffing enemies, we already have a couple of debuffs that are pretty important in the game. You've got the Demon Hunter one, the Monk one, which is physical and magical. Um, Other than that, there's not really loads of debuffs that I can think of in the game currently. And that's something that's been designed out of the game because they didn't like it. It wasn't something that fitted in WoW's culture. Um, but it's one of those things that if they bring debuffs, they have to either be so strong that they make up for the fact that you don't have a DPS in their place and therefore the debuffs are worth it, or they're going to be just not brought at all. Now, I think it's very unlikely that they bring off healing as a choice thing to, especially this like theorized Black Dragonfly evoker, mainly because they have a preservation spec, right? So they're not likely to want you to, because I promise you, as soon as we see if they had off healing, you would have groups running one tank, three DPS, and a support evoker instead of an actual healer. And that would become the meta very quickly, especially if they had buffs and debuffs alongside it. They would be trying to, because that's already something that we see in the healer role. We see in the healer role, it's about minimizing the amount of healing you do, maximizing the amount of damage or utility that you bring. So it really is something that it's going to be very, very, very hard to balance. And trying to do that in WoW's current like class ecosystem is just going to be nigh on impossible. And the problem only increases when you take this out of a dungeon setting and look at things like PvP. Imagine the arms warrior support healer comps that just last for 30 minutes because you can't kill him, he's just immortal, and they just beat you on dampening. And in raiding, what's going to happen when do you need to bring multiple supports to buff certain people? Do you need to bring only one support? Is there only now one support role per raid to apply certain debuffs? You get to this point where you're starting to either add or remove people based on their class and not based on the player, which is something they've moved away from a long time ago in WoW. So Blizzard have the option of moving this into a tank spec, and it's something that has already been discussed. And a focus on like minor buffs and debuffs as part of their tanking kit. And I think that's their best option in this scenario, personally. I think if they could do something that has, like I said, very minor buffs or debuffs, it would be a reason to bring the tank. They maybe do a little bit less damage, but bring something else in terms of, like I said, a damage buff or a healing buff or whatever that looks like, or group utility. But I personally don't see a support being added to WoW, even though there's so many hints and theories to say that they're thinking about it. I really like the idea, and actually, if it came into the game, it would be something I played regularly. I play support in other games. I play tank a lot at the moment. I really enjoy that role of supporting people and maximizing what other people can do. And it also opens up other classes from like a lore perspective. You have rogues that would very easily fit into a bard spec, or hunters with minstrel, or priests with like an enlightenment spec. But the balance would potentially forever be ruined. And once it's something that's been added, it's very, very difficult to remove it. Now, there is precedent for them doing something like this in terms of like adding a talent spec. Druids had it with Feral. Feral was eventually split from Feral to Feral and Guardian. So it is something that could happen, and they could really go down this route of adding another spec to Evoker. Um, but I really think it's going to be a bad idea. So, guys, I'm really interested. What's your thoughts on this? Is it something that you'd like to see in the game? There are games that pull it off. Look at League of Legends. It has a very, very healthy support role. They do different roles in that sort of area. They have enchanters, they have tanks, they have kind of DPS heavy supports. Is that something, that sort of mentality that you'd like to see? What would you like to see, basically? But yeah, so thanks for watching. like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'm really, really interested in hearing your comments around this. So thanks for watching, and catch you later. Goodbye.